She had come to France to discover this fascinating country, delve deep into its culture and language. But one fateful day, she crosses paths with a sinister individual, someone capable of taking everything away. It's a chilly morning in a suburb northwest of Paris. Like every day, a 12-year-old boy and his cousin are out walking their dog. Suddenly, the dog sprints off towards an abandoned car park, and the boys follow suit. As they catch up, they spot a blue object on the ground, and under closer inspection, they realise that it's a sleeping bag, and it looks like there's someone inside. The dog is barking furiously at this blue bag, wildly out of place in this urban wasteland. The boys give it a little kick, but nothing happens. They call out to their dad that they found a guy in a sleeping bag, and he joins them to see what all the fuss is about. He opens the bag, pulls back the hood, and immediately jumps back in horror. It's not a guy, it's a woman. Her clothes are soaked in blood. She is dead. My name is Nick. This is Crime Dog. Roll the intro. When the paramedics arrive, they gently remove the woman from the sleeping bag. It's a young Caucasian woman, late 20s, early 30s, with long brown hair. She was found face down with her arms crossed. She's wearing a t-shirt and on top of that an oversized checked shirt, possibly a man's. Her face is a frightening shade of blue, severely bruised and swollen. She also has strangulation marks around her neck. The police show up soon after and check the body for ID. They don't find anything and her pockets are empty. They do, however, notice something out of the ordinary. The weather had been terrible for the past few days, yet the body and the sleeping bag were perfectly dry. It becomes clear that the woman had not died here. She must have been brought to this spot and dumped after being killed somewhere else. They leave the crime scene with more questions than answers. Who was this woman? How did she end up in this terrible state? And who could have committed such a heinous crime? The autopsy reveals she received severe blows to the head from a blunt object, 13 fractures in all. She'd also been strangled twice, first with hands and then secondly with a cord. The marked grooves were obvious on her neck. The coroner concludes she'd been dead no more than 24 to 30 hours max. There were no signs of any sexual offence. She had a period at the time and was wearing a tampon. There's something else. He found fragments under her nails. It looks like she put up a mighty struggle, so we may have the killer's DNA. They also find hairs not belonging to the victim in the sleeping bag. All this evidence is sent off to the lab for analysis. Police officers canvass the neighbourhood with a photo, but no one recognises her. They watch all the video footage from the 5 surveillance cameras in the area, but it gives them nothing. So they issue a search notice with Interpol, and bingo, a week later, they receive a call. A young Australian woman is missing, 28 years old, 5'2", with chestnut hair and green eyes. She was supposed to leave France for New York at the beginning of January, but her family hadn't heard anything from her since New Year's Eve. Her profile is a match for our victim. Her name is Jeanette O'Keefe. They also have a last known address for her. She'd been staying in a student hostel about 20 kilometers south of Paris. Detectives head straight there. When they show the hostel owner a photo of the woman's face, she is horrified, but she recognizes her. The owner checks the register and confirms she left her room on December the 31st. She actually saw her leave. She had a huge backpack and a very large suitcase. They also find out she was taking French lessons, so they head over to the school. They speak to the teachers who say she was a discreet girl. Same reaction from her fellow students. Then a man approaches them. His name is Anthony Martin. He's from New Zealand. He says he's a friend of Jeanette O'Keefe. He claims to have visited Paris with her on several occasions, but he hadn't heard from or seen her since December the 31st. He says she called him that day at approximately 7 p.m. in a blind panic. She was supposed to be meeting her friend Elise earlier that day and sleep over at her place, but she hadn't shown up, so she had no idea where she was going to sleep that night. Her flight wasn't leaving to New York until January the 2nd. She asked if he could put her up for a couple of nights, and he agreed. So he gave her a time and a place to meet, in front of a restaurant on the Champs-Élysées at around 8:30, 9 p.m. Problem is he arrived late, and when he got there was no sign of Jeanette. He waited about 20 minutes until approximately 10:30 p.m. and then he went home alone. He hadn't heard from her since then. As far as we know, Anthony Martin was the last person to speak to Jeanette, so he has to be considered a suspect. They managed to access his emails, and they are drawn to one message in particular. Anthony had sent an email to Jeanette O'Keefe's mother, in which he explained how he'd missed his meeting with Jeanette on the Champs-Elysees that night. Following an earlier meeting in the suburbs, he had got stuck in traffic. When police had asked him where he'd been that day, he never mentioned another meeting in the suburbs. Moreover, when they track his cell phone, detectives realised that on the evening of December the 31st, Anthony Martin made it to the Champs-Elysees way earlier than he'd said, at approximately 8:45. He was on time for his meeting with Jeanette. Why did he lie? Why did he not meet her if he was there on time? They track him down and they take him in for questioning. They ask him what really happened that night. Straight away he admits to lying. He says he was very angry with her. He had invited her around for Christmas dinner, prepared a superb meal, but she never showed up. She had called him at 9 p.m. to say she was tired. 3 days later, he was stuck waiting for her again. So out of spite, he purposefully showed up late that night on the Champs-Elysees. Detectives are not sure what to think of Mr. Martin. He did tell a barefaced lie. He's also quite a lot older than Jeanette. He's in his 40s, she's in her 20s. She had turned down his dinner invitation. Maybe she'd also turned down his advances. He leaves the station a free man and is still considered a credible suspect, told not to leave the country. You never know. Except 2 months later, it turns out it wasn't his DNA found underneath Jeanette's nails. It was another man. So the Kiwi trail is officially closed. Now what? Back to no suspects. So they go back over everything they'd learned up until this point. Jeanette leaves the hostel late afternoon. According to Anthony, she had a rendezvous to spend New Year's Eve with her friend Elise, who lives in Clichy, northwest Paris. They pay Elise a visit. She states she waited for her, as agreed, in front of the town hall, but she never showed up. There's a problem here. Elise says that Jeanette didn't show up, but Anthony says that Jeanette told him that Elise didn't show up. Could Jeanette have simply just misunderstood the rendezvous point? Not being from Paris, she could have easily confused the town hall of Clichy with the main square, for example. It's at 7:30 that Jeanette calls Anthony Martin to ask if she could stay at his place. He agrees and sets a rendezvous for 8:30 on the Champs-Elysees. But as she's already stood him up several times, he deliberately shows up late. And that's how we find Jeanette alone on the evening of December the 31st, with her large backpack and suitcase in the midst of thousands of partygoers headed to the Champs-Elysees to celebrate the new year. Police learned that Jeanette, who was completely lost, then called Elise's parents. They didn't want to leave her stranded, but they didn't live very close to Paris and hardly spoke any English. They attempted to explain how to get to them, but she was struggling to take it all in. They reckon she must have taken the wrong line. They waited for her all evening, but she just didn't show up. It's possible she tried to call them back, but they realised the next morning that they hadn't hung up the phone properly, so any call wouldn't have come through. The new hypothesis then is that she took the wrong train and ran into some bad news along the way. There's no sign of her on CCTV. Police put up posters in search of any witnesses, but no one comes forward. All they have left to go on is the DNA found under Jeanette's nails. So they demand a sample from every male living in close proximity to where the body was found. There are 120 men and they are summoned one by one. The problem is that out of the 120, very few respond to the summons. There is major mistrust towards the police in these neighbourhoods. They are unwilling to hand over their DNA to any authority, and police can't force them to do so. In the end, the operation is a complete failure. At this point, the case goes ice cold. 7 years go by, and at this rate it looks like the murder of Jeanette O'Keefe will end up just another unsolved case in a dusty drawer. But during all this time, the police continued to work away, collecting DNA from all the men living in the area. It took time to convince them to comply, but by 2008, they have all finally given their DNA, all except 6. And as time has gone by, and the DNA database has gathered a great deal more data, suddenly in 2009, they get a hit. They have a match. His name is Adriano Araujo da Silva, a Frenchman of Brazilian origin. He had recently ended up in the database after ramming a police car during a traffic stop. Detectives realized that da Silva is one of the 6 men from Le Cité des Musiciens who refused to give his DNA. It would seem he's banged to rights. He's arrested on February the 17th, 2009 at 6 a.m. Officers place into custody a tall man with a shaved head and broad shoulders. They are hoping for a quick confession, but no such luck. He denies being involved. When asked why he refused to give a DNA sample, he states he had nothing to do with the incident, so didn't feel it necessary. Then officers play their trump card. They tell De Silva that they found his DNA under the victim's nails. Usually in a criminal case, when somebody gets caught by their DNA, they understand straight away. They understand that with or without a confession, they will end up being prosecuted, and that with or without a confession, they will probably end up being convicted. DNA is now the holy grail of criminal evidence. It would seem it would therefore be in his interest to confess. A man who confesses in the face of indisputable evidence will always be treated better than a stubborn person who continues to deny it. But at first, he resists. Detectives send him to a cell to let him stew, let him think it over. They pull him out in the middle of the night and continue the interrogation. How do you explain the presence of your DNA under Jeanette O'Keefe's nails? His explanation is weak. He admits to seeing her on New Year's Eve. He claims she was being attacked by a group of youths, so he jumped in to help her out. Her instinct was that he was also there to attack her, so she scratched him. Nice try, Mr. De Silva. But how will you explain that several strands of hair were found in the sleeping bag that covered the body, and that these hairs, Mr. De Silva, belong to you? He sits there for a few minutes in silence, desperately trying to come up with another lame excuse. The cops change tact and bring up his wife. They ask him if everything is going well in their couple. He replies yes, and he requests a phone call. The usual tactic would be to isolate the suspect, but in this case they make an exception. They leave him alone and let him make his phone call. Outside the room, officers are listening to every word he says. By the end of the call, it's game, set and match. He tells his wife he will be going away for a while. He killed a woman. He tells her he loves her and for her to wait for his return. When officers come back in, accepting of his fate, De Silva starts to talk. He says he met Jeanette on the Champs-Elysees. She looked sad and they started talking. Since she was stuck with all her luggage, he offered to let her stay at his place and she agreed. So according to De Silva, they went back to his place and ended up making love. He says he wanted to repeat the experience, but that she didn't want to. When she asked to leave, he refused. He proceeded to strike her with an iron bar. She started screaming, so he strangled her with his bare hands, then put an electric cable around her neck and strung her up. He then says he sits down with the corpse for some time, not knowing what to do. So he dresses her, puts her back in the sleeping bag, and throws her out of the window. But then he thought maybe it's not the best idea to leave her right below my window. So he went down and dragged Jeanette and the sleeping bag to the wasteland, where the boys would discover it 2 days later. His story perfectly corroborates the information gathered during the investigation, except one point. He says he had sex with her and killed her because she didn't want to do it again. However, remember what the coroner said in 2001. There was no sign of any sexual offense. He did not sleep with her. He is lying. That said, he sticks to his story and repeats it word for word to the district attorney. However, 2 months later, he retracts. He claims the confession was beaten out of him. Too late, Mr. De Silva. His trial begins on January the 3rd, 2012. An inquiry into his personality reveals troubling details from his past. He was born in Brazil, the result of his mother sleeping with a married man. To save face, his mother hid the birth, and he was brought up by a couple of peasants. When Adriano was 5 years old, his mother goes to see the father and tells him he has a son. Surprisingly, the father takes Adriano in and they move to France. Not mainland France, Guyana. But the paternal instincts don't last very long, and soon enough Adriano ends up on the streets of Cayenne begging. His father abandoned him. Then the mother of a little boy who was about the same age as Adriano goes to see the father to propose an adoption. And the father agrees, of course. He couldn't wait to get rid of him. And that's how Adriano becomes French. At 23, he arrives in the Paris region, and since he is well built, he gets a job working for a removal company. But he struggles to keep a job down, plus he's a ladies' man. He sleeps around and has several children dotted all over Paris. The investigation reveals that he is violent with all of these women. As with many murderers, he was carrying with him the life-changing consequences of a lack of love, rejection, and abandonment. The inquiry concludes that he has tremendous resentment towards women due to the fact that he was abandoned by his mother. He has transferred the anger to all the women in his life. In fact, all women in general. This is of course no excuse for the horrendous murder of Jeanette O'Keefe, but it gives us some context. The accused maintains his most recent version of the facts. De Silva is condemned to 30 years, with a minimum sentence of 20. At the time of filming, he is still in prison. Jeanette's parents, Kevin and Susan, were both too ill to make the grueling journey over to the trial. Mr. O'Keefe explained that he wouldn't be able to bear seeing the explicit photos and exhibits, saying the worst stress of all is grief. Now that De Silva has been brought to justice, this guilty verdict will at least bring the O'Keefe family some closure, but nothing can ever bring back their daughter. Please leave us a comment if you have any thoughts on this tragedy, and feel free to watch this next case, just as shocking and also taking place in the French capital. Until next time, please look after yourselves and one another.